this story, the Dalai Lama's succession announcement, is a very major development when it comes to the future of India-China relations. Now, in case you are not aware, I have been a very vocal. I've been very vocal in my in my statements about the Dalai Lama and what needs to happen. In case you're not aware of what I have said in the past, here is a brief recap. He needs to announce his plans for his reincarnation, because the Chinese plan to hijack the office of the Dalai Lama and appoint their own Dalai Lama. So if His Holiness the Dalai Lama announces that he will not be reincarnated in Tibet, he will be reincarnated either in India or somewhere else, then the Chinese claim to the legitimacy of their appointee as the Dalai Lama will evaporate. His Holiness the Dalai Lama is now at the stage where he needs to decide about his succession. Who's going to be the next Dalai Lama? Will he reincarnate in Chinese occupied Tibet, or will he reincarnate in the diaspora outside of Tibet? So this is the succession the Chinese are worried about, because they want to appoint their own Dalai Lama. And if the current Dalai Lama says that that is illegitimate, then the Chinese attempt to hijack the institution of the Dalai Lama will fail. The 11th Panchen Lama, they hijacked that institution. So once he passes on, the Chinese government will hijack that process and they will appoint a CCP Dalai Lama, a Chinese Communist Party sanctioned Dalai Lama. It is something that is important from multiple perspectives, including a geopolitical perspective. The Dalai Lama needs to announce, he needs to make his intentions clear, whether he does intend to be reincarnated or not. Eventually, whenever the India-China issue will be resolved, the root cause is Tibet. The illegal, illegitimate, brutal Chinese occupation of Tibet. It is high time for His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, to declare what is the succession going to be like. The Dalai Lama's successor has to be non-Chinese. Ideally, what His Holiness should do is he should make a clear, unambiguous declaration of how the issue of the succession should be handled. So, with that recap, hopefully it should be clear that I have been very consistent in saying for more than 4 years at least that His Holiness the Dalai Lama needs to announce his path forward. Path forward as in the next lifetime, right? He needs to announce his what is the status of his reincarnation. Will he reincarnate or not? If he does reincarnate, where will he reincarnate, and how will the next Dalai Lama be chosen? Now, is this a religious issue, my friends? Is this a religious issue? Is this something that is limited to Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism? It's not. This is not a religious issue. This is not merely a religious issue. This is a geopolitical issue. This is an issue about Tibet's status and Tibet's sovereignty. And the leader of the Tibetan people has historically for centuries been the Dalai Lama. So he occupies a geopolitical position essentially, in a sense. And by announcing that the succession will be handled in a certain way, he is directly challenging China's occupation of Tibet. And it has come at a very interesting time. So India and China, we've always had this issue, right? Since the 1950s, where China has been claiming Indian territory. So all of this needs to be seen in the light of that. So let's now go through what has happened. And we will also do some forecasting as to what could happen over the next year or so when it comes to India-China relations in the context of this earth-shaking announcement. So His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, has now finally announced his succession, right? And this has, like we see here, it has sent shockwaves across the diplomatic corridors of Beijing and New Delhi. This is a pivotal moment in Tibetan Buddhism and in international relations in the India-China relationship. So just a couple of days before his 90th birthday, His Holiness, he announced yesterday he ended years of speculation about his succession. And now we're gonna see. I mean, we are already seeing lots of experts saying that there'll be prolonged confrontation between competing visions of Tibetan spiritual authority, which essentially means there's going to be a prolonged confrontation between India and China. Uh, Now, to understand what's going on over here, in case many of you may not be aware, we need to look back in time and understand the chronological development of India-China relations. Since essentially 1947, since India became independent, we'll do it quickly. Will not take too long, right? So India gained independence in 1947, as we all know, right? Independence, or whatever you want to call it. We became a dominion of the UK in 47, and so on. Eventually, we became technically independent. So at that time in 1947, Tibet existed as an independent state, as an independent nation. And India treated Tibet as an independent country, and we maintained diplomatic relations that we had inherited from the British. We inherited everything from the British, and we continued that. We maintained those relations. We had trade agencies in Yangtze, in Yatung, in Gartok. Uh, so Tibet was kind of an Indian protectorate, you could say, at that time. Now, in 1949, the People's Republic of China was established after Mao Zedong and his Chinese Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War, and Mao announced plans to liberate Tibet in quotes. Uh, and this marked the beginning of the Tibet issue as a central factor in India-China relations. And India's response to the Chinese invasion was very, very restrained. Uh, India's Prime Minister, Mr. Nehru, he adopted a policy of conciliation and appeasement of China, despite Tibet appealing for support repeatedly for Indian support. Those Tibetan appeals for support fell on deaf ears when it comes to Mr. Nehru, and he adopted a policy of conciliating China and appeasing China. Tibet sought India's sponsorship for a UN appeal against China's aggression, but Mr. Nehru, he firmly declined. He said that China was not represented at the UN, and Tibet was not recognized internationally, despite India having treated Tibet as a sovereign country. So Mr. Nehru was very interested, for some reason, in establishing strong relations with Mao Zedong's People's Republic of China. So Mr. Nehru started appeasing China, and between 1951 and 54, we had the 17-point agreement between India and China, and the infamous Panchashil. So the controversial 17-point agreement was signed between China and Tibet. This was signed under duress, obviously. It was called the Agreement of the Central People's Government and the Local Government of Tibet on measures for the peaceful liberation of Tibet. So this agreement, which was signed essentially at gunpoint, it formalized China's control over Tibet while promising some vague autonomy. And yeah, this agreement was signed without the authorization of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. Now, India's position on Tibet underwent a significant shift with the Panchashil agreement that was signed in 1954. This was a treaty between India and China, which was formally called the Agreement on Trade and Intercourse between Tibet region and India. And it first officially referred to Tibet as the Tibet region of China. And through this agreement, India formally recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet and gave up all rights inherited from the British Raj. And the Panchashil agreement established 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which the Chinese have repeatedly trampled over. So we don't need to mention what those principles were. And this would eventually be regarded as a Himalayan blunder by Mr. Nehru. Then in 1959, there was a Tibetan uprising, which led to His Holiness the Dalai Lama going into exile and coming to India. So the most crucial turning point in the Tibet factor of India-China relations came in March 1959. There was widespread Tibetan resistance to Chinese rule, disenchantment to Chinese under Chinese rule. push back against Chinese oppression of the Tibetan people, and a major uprising erupted in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, in March 1959. More than 300,000 Tibetans surrounded the Potala Palace to protect the Dalai Lama, because there was a fear that he might be arrested or eliminated by the Chinese occupying troops. In March 1959, on March 17, the Dalai Lama, who was then 23 years old, he disguised himself as a soldier and he fled Tibet. He reached India on March 19, 1959, and the Indian government, well, thankfully, gave granted asylum to him, and this fundamentally altered India-China relations, because China now viewed India's decision to grant refuge and asylum to the Dalai Lama as a hostile act. And this, the Dalai Lama fleeing Tibet and being granted asylum in India, it this exodus included about 80,000 Tibetan refugees who followed the Dalai Lama into exile in India. And India established 45 residential settlements across 10 states to accommodate the Tibetan refugees, exilees. And then a Tibetan government in exile was established in Dharamshala, which created a permanent source of tension, you could say, between the two countries. Then in 1962, we had the Sino-Indian War, right? So this was directly linked to the Tibet issue. China's invasion of India was motivated by fears that maybe India wanted to re-establish Tibet as a so-called buffer state between India and China. And the Chinese leadership of Mao Zedong, it believed that India had inherited this policy from British rulers, and they claimed, they alleged that India was using Tibet to undermine Chinese sovereignty. Well, that was nonsense, because Mr. Nehru was super deferential, super conciliatory to Tibet, to China, and he had consistently adopted a policy of appeasing Mao Zedong. Nevertheless, the war happened. It was provoked by a series of violent border incidents after the 1949 uprising. China was claiming territorial. China was making territorial claims in Ladakh. They claimed that historically Ladakh was part of Tibet. That's why it belonged to China. Right? And so China first captured Tibet, and then it used its control over Tibet to make ever expanding territorial claims against India. And this war resulted in a defeat for India. Right? Chinese forces across they advanced across Ladakh and also Arunachal Pradesh. But then China declared a unilateral ceasefire after 31 days of fighting, and they withdrew to pre-war positions, but they captured some Indian territory, Aksai Chin and so on. They had to withdraw because of harsh fighting conditions and very high altitudes, and also concerns about the USSR's reaction to all of this. Now, before we go further, we have to understand what's the root of the Chinese claim over Tibet. They have justified their annexation of Tibet by saying that Chinese empires used to rule over Tibet. Now, the truth is that it was the Chinese, so-called supposedly Chinese Yuan dynasty, that had that sort of relationship with Tibet. Tibet was a protectorate of the Yuan dynasty, but the Yuan dynasty was not a Chinese dynasty. It was a conquest dynasty. The Yuan dynasty's founder was the great Mongol conqueror Chinggis Khan, and the first official emperor, the first real emperor of China of the Yuan dynasty, was Kublai Khan, and Chinggis Khan was then retrospectively declared as the first emperor of the Yuan dynasty. And the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan, it adopted Tibetan Buddhism as the de facto state religion. And then because of that, there was this guru shishya kind of relationship between Tibet and Mongolia, the Yuan dynasty. Tibet was the guru and Mongolia was the shishya and the protector of Tibet. They offered their military protection to Tibet. They never occupied Tibet physically, militarily, and Tibet was a protectorate. So the Chinese now claim that the Yuan dynasty was a Chinese dynasty and it had sovereignty over Tibet. And by making that fictitious, completely ahistorical claim, they have sought to legitimize their occupation of Tibet. So that's the background. Now let's come back here and let's move forward from 1962. In 1967, there was a brief war between India and China, which India won. Okay, then for a few decades there were very chilled relations between India and China, and then there was Mr. Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China and some rapprochement between India and China. So Mr. Rajiv Gandhi visited China on an official state visit in December 1988. Uh, this caused a significant thaw in India-China relations. This was the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister to China in about 34 years. And it was described as an ice-breaking trip by Chinese diplomats. So during this visit, a Sino-Indian joint press communique was released, which modified India's position on Tibet as Tibet region of China, and India acknowledged Tibet as an autonomous region of China. This was a semantic adjustment, and you could say it reflected India's efforts to manage the Tibet issue diplomatically while maintaining relations with China. So this visit by Mr. Gandhi, it marked a period of somewhat better relations, although the fundamental differences remained unresolved, and China consistently kept on refusing to demarcate the India Tibet in the India Xinjiang border. Then we move forward to 15 years forward to 2003. So a major shift happened during Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee's visit to China in June 2003. Uh, India and China signed the Declaration on Principles for Relations and Comprehensive Cooperation. So, in this declaration, under Prime Minister Vajpayee, India explicitly recognized for the first time that the Tibet Autonomous Region is part of the territory of the People's Republic of China. And India also reaffirmed that it will not allow Tibetans to engage in anti-China political activities in India. So, this was the most explicit Indian recognition of Chinese sovereignty over Tibet since the Nehruvian era. And what was the Chinese response to this? The moment this happened, China started doubling down on its claims on India's Arunachal Pradesh. So the moment India explicitly recognized Tibet as a part of China, which essentially ended the Tibet dispute, and ended Tibet's status as a disputed territory. The moment India did this, China started expanding its territorial claims over India. And in 2006, the Chinese ambassador to India claimed that all of Arunachal Pradesh was Chinese territory. And that's the first time most Indians heard about this Chinese claim on Arunachal Pradesh. So this declaration became a reference point for China to subsequently make more and more claims, more broader claims over Indian territory. And Mr. Vajpayee's recognition of Tibet as sovereign Chinese territory, it became a reference point that China repeatedly invoked in subsequent years to constrain India's policy on Tibet. So that's Mr. Vajpayee's role in the matter. Unilaterally, he gave away Tibet to China. Maybe he thought that by making unilateral gestures, just like Mr. Gandhi used to do, it would lead to better relations. It led to the exact opposite thing. Then you have the Modi era and multiple policy shifts. So Mr. Modi came to power in 2014. And initially, India formalized the Tibetan Rehabilitation Policy 2014, which provided clearer guidelines for the welfare of Tibetan refugees and land lease rights and economic activities. And you may recall that when Mr. Modi was sworn in with his cabinet, when he was sworn in with his cabinet as prime minister in 2014, the Tibetan Sikyong, the Tibetan political leader, the de facto prime minister of the Tibetan government in exile, he also posed with Prime Minister Modi and other world leaders at Rashtrapati Bhavan. So there was a signal to China for sure. But then around 2018, India temporarily took a pause on Tibet. And the Ministry of External Affairs of India, it issued directives to government officials to stay away from Central Tibetan administration events marking the 60th anniversary of the Dalai Lama's flight to India. And this came just before the first informal summit between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping in Wuhan in 2018, April 2018, the Wuhan summit. So before the summit, India kind of paused these, took a pause on its coordination with the Tibetan administration. Then you had the Galwan clash in June 2020, and India resumed uh, playing the Tibet card, so to say, more assertively. So India publicly recognized the Special Frontier Force, which is an elite unit which draws personnel mainly from the Tibetan exile community, which had remained covert since its inception, since its formation after the 1962 war. So India publicly recognized this force. And in 2021, Prime Minister Modi publicly wished the Dalai Lama well on his 86th birthday, which once again marked a shift in India's willingness to publicly engage with the Tibetan leadership despite Chinese objections. So India's policy during this era, during this period of engaging with Tibet, depended on its relationship with China. So, how closely was was the government of India interacting with the Tibetan government in exile, or how withdrawn was the Indian government from the Tibetan government in exile? It depended on the status of India-China ties at any given point in time. Now, going back uh, to 2017, we had the Doklam crisis, the Doklam standoff, and this once again brought Tibet's strategic importance, geographical importance, front and center. This occurred when Chinese troops began constructing a road in Doklam, which is Bhutanese territory, but it is also strategically important to India. And China started constructing a road there, and Indian troops intervened on June 18, 2017, which led to a 73-day standoff. Um, so China is not just claiming Indian territory; it's claiming Bhutanese territory, all because it occupies Tibet. It militarily controls Tibet. So Tibet is central to the India-China dispute, and the Doklam plateau. It is very near the Siliguri corridor, which is a major, you could say, the chicken's neck for India, and it's a strategically vulnerable geographical region for India. So China trying to construct a road there was unacceptable to India, and it shows how Tibet is central to the India-China strategic competition. Then you had the uh, Galwan Valley incident, the Galwan Valley clash that happened in 2020, the first fatal confrontation between the two nations in 45 years along the LAC. 20 Indian soldiers are confirmed dead, and a large number of Chinese troops were also killed, but the number was never disclosed by China. They've tried to hide it. This happened at a time when China was increasing its military buildup in Tibet, and it was trying to unilaterally alter the status quo along the line of actual control. So this was part of China's strategy to strengthen its military infrastructure in Tibet, which came as a response to India's increased, infrastructure buildup on the Indian side of the border. Since Nehruvian times, successive Indian governments neglected building infrastructure along the India-Tibet border for whatever reason. But under the Modi government, India has been pushing forward with infrastructure building activities in the region, which is very important. And that set off alarm bells in China, and that eventually led to clashes like the Galwan Valley clash. Uh, and then China approved major hydroelectric projects along the Brahmaputra River, and it is conducting massive infrastructure development in Tibet. So this is creating additional military pressure on India. And then there was a disengagement process from various friction points that began sometime in 2020-21, and eventually there was disengagement from the Pangong Lake region in February 21, and the tensions remained in the Depsang Plains in the Dimchok region until October 24, when India and China reached an agreement allowing resumption of patrolling as it existed before May 2020. So it looked like there would be some kind of a rapprochement between India and China. That's the signals that were being seen in late 2024. But now things have changed. Things have changed now significantly. There's going to be no India-China friendship. And the very fact that this announcement has come from the Dalai Lama, it puts a seal on the whole matter. The matter is finished, and the so-called disengagement, the so-called rapprochement, it's not going to happen. India-China friendship, which was supposed to be possible, it's not happening now. This is a very clear uh, signal to China that we are very firm on the Tibet matter, and that's why the Dalai Lama has gone ahead and made this announcement. I can assure you, an announcement like this happens in coordination with the government of India. The Dalai Lama, uh, he won't make it unilaterally. So let's talk about the succession announcement which happened yesterday. What are the key details? So this announcement was delivered in a pre-recorded video message. It happened during a 3-day conference of spiritual leaders in Dharamshala. And His Holiness made several crucial announcements which fundamentally reshaped the succession landscape. So His Holiness affirmed that the institution of the Dalai Lama will continue, which has totally ended speculation that he might be the last to hold on to this position, which is 600 years old. He is not going to be the last to hold on to this position. And he declared that the Gaden Phodrang Trust, which is a non-profit organization that he established in 2015, this trust would have the sole authority to recognize the future reincarnation. And his statement was unambiguous. No one else has any such authority to interfere in this matter. So he has put the matter to rest. Now, any future Chinese attempts to rake up this matter or to install a puppet Dalai Lama, well, this statement by the existing Dalai Lama, that should put the matter to rest, and it will make any such Chinese action completely illegitimate. Now, what's the decision process like? This announcement came after years of appeals from various quarters. I personally have been saying that the Dalai Lama needs to make this announcement. So the Dalai Lama explained that his decision to make this announcement was influenced by numerous requests from Tibetan spiritual leaders, members of the Tibetan parliament in exile, the Buddhist diaspora in the Himalayas, in Mongolia, the Buddhist Sangha in the Russian Federation, across Asia, and also in mainland China. And he mentioned that lots of people sent him messages through various channels. Even Tibetans in Tibet did this, making the same appeal. So the Dalai Lama emphasized that his successor should be chosen in accordance with past tradition. He rejected any interference from external entities, which is the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. So this is a huge move. It's a significant departure from previous uncertainty that we had. This atmosphere of uncertainty that prevailed for years. And because in 2011, for example, he had suggested that he might be the last Dalai Lama. And he said that the decision would be made on his 90th birthday. So the decision is made, and it's a momentous decision. So what has the Chinese response been like? They are trying to assert their authority. Their response was immediate, essentially. The Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson said that the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, the Panchen Lama, and other great Buddhist figures must be chosen by drawing lots from a golden urn, and it has to be approved by the central government. So she is saying, the Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson, excuse me, was essentially saying that something that is in the realm of the spiritual world will come under the authority of the Chinese Communist Party, which is utter nonsense, right? And this is a reference to some golden urn ceremony, some kind of method that the Qing dynasty had attempted to introduce in 1792. So this golden urn is a very contentious aspect of the succession dispute, and China tries to use this to claim its legitimacy, to claim that their authority is legitimate over Tibetan reincarnations. And the Dalai Lama has consistently rejected this process. He has said multiple times in the past that this proposal was imposed by the Manchus, and the Tibetans had no faith in it because it lacked any spiritual quality. So the golden urn um, ceremony, or whatever it is illegitimate, and it will not be followed. Um, and the Chinese officials are making broader claims about Tibetan Buddhism itself. They are saying that the Tibetan Buddhism was born in China and carries Chinese characteristics, which is ridiculous, right? Um, so the Chinese have tried to reframe Tibetan Buddhism as inherently Chinese rather than distinctively Tibetan. And this is a completely ridiculous claim that the Chinese have made. And so that's the background. Now, what are the geopolitical implications of this? This is not merely a religious matter. So, first of all, let's take a look at a precedent that we have. This child that you see on the screen is the Panchen Lama. So we can understand this succession dispute better against the backdrop of the Panchen Lama succession that happened in 1995, or the events of 1995, which is a troubling precedent for what may unfold. So the Dalai Lama in 1995, he recognized a 6-year-old Tibetan child as the 11th Panchen Lama. And the Chinese response was brutal. They immediately disappeared the child and his family. And the child and his family, they remain missing even today after more than 30 years. And China has installed its own puppet Panchen Lama, who is widely rejected by Tibetans. So this is a Chinese Communist Party approved and rubber stamped Panchen Lama that the Chinese claim is the legitimate Panchen Lama, and they have disappeared this boy and his entire family. So now that we see this, what may happen is that we may be faced eventually with the prospect of two Dalai Lamas, dual Dalai Lamas. One will be recognized by the Gadan Phodrang Trust and Tibetan Buddhist authorities and Tibetans worldwide and Buddhist people worldwide. And another Dalai Lama will be a puppet appointed by Beijing. And this could create some kind of crisis of legitimacy. And it could possibly have far-reaching consequences for the global Buddhist community. So this obviously intersects with the regional power competition. China is attempting to control Tibetan Buddhism. It wants to use Tibetan Buddhism to assert cultural and political dominance across the Tibetan plateau. And it wants to use that to legitimize its occupation, its illegitimate, illegal occupation of Tibet. And Tibet obviously has geopolitical consequences. It is strategically crucial for border security and water resources and other resources that China seeks to exploit, right? So this is now going to be a new friction point in India-China relations. India is the host country for the Dalai Lama, and it's the host country for the Tibetan government in exile. Since 1969, this has been the case. So India has significant stakes in the outcome of the Dalai Lama's succession. And on July 3rd, which is yesterday, India stated that the Dalai Lama's successor should be chosen only by the present Dalai Lama and with the established conventions, not Chinese Communist Party invented conventions. And there is the Dharamshala factor. The Gadan Phodrang Trust operates from India, from Dharamshala. So this could, the succession of the Dalai Lama, whenever it happens, China is afraid that this could give India significant soft power advantages. Dharamshala will become the seat of Tibetan spiritual legitimacy. It used to be Lhasa, it used to be the Potala Palace, now it will be Dharamshala. And China fears that this positioning could enhance India's influence among Buddhist populations across Asia, in countries like Mongolia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Vietnam, and even Russia, where you have a Buddhist Sangha and all. That fear, well, India already has tremendous influence among Buddhist populations, because India is the birthplace of Buddhism, so to say, right? But you have this, right? So now let's take a look at what could happen. So this is a forward-looking show, geostrategy. So let's take a look at what could happen in the next year or so, right? India and China, the relationship. So let's try and see some scenarios. Let's try and do some forecasts. What are the top 5 developments that could ensue from this particular announcement of the Dalai Lama? Let's take a look at the first forecast for the next 365 days. So this is guaranteed, more or less. There's going to be diplomatic escalation and drawing of red lines by both countries. India will draw red lines, China will draw red lines, or maybe the Chinese will start, and then we will respond. So China has no option but to launch a full spectrum diplomatic pressure campaign against India, and they will demand that India should curb all activities of the Tibetan government in exile, and India will have to publicly rebuff these demands. This will lead to a freeze in high-level political dialogue between the two countries, and there's going to be a reinforcement of mutually exclusive positions on Tibetan sovereignty and autonomy. So Tibet is once again going to be a disputed area. You understand that? The core issue when it comes to India-China relations is Tibet. It's not the undemarcated border. It's the Chinese occupation of Tibet. So Tibet is now going to become the front and center issue once again, as it should be. So let's take a look at some scenarios. What is the most likely scenario? Scenario A: there's going to be formal protests and there's going to be a war of words. I think there's a probability, I assess that this has a probability of 90% in the next 7 to 30 days. It's going to happen very fast. In the next 7 to 30 days, there's a 90% probability that this scenario comes to pass. So what is this scenario? So it will begin with Beijing issuing multiple harsh diplomatic demarches and public condemnations. They will accuse, the Chinese will accuse India of abetting separatist forces. India will respond with carefully worded statements affirming that the Dalai Lama is a respected spiritual leader, and India will deny any official support for Tibetan independence. Effectively, India will maintain a status quo, but there's going to be heightened friction, rhetorical friction, and this is going to have the effect of souring the atmosphere for any bilateral talks, particularly on border resolution, which doesn't matter because relations are soured anyway. China is openly supporting Pakistan. China is kind of elbowing India out of certain aspects of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and so on. And there are historical precedents to this. In 2022, when Prime Minister Modi wished the Dalai Lama happy birthday, there were diplomatic protests from China. When the US ambassador to India visited Arunachal Pradesh in 2016, China reacted very, very strongly. So we have historical precedents that could show us that this scenario is a very likely scenario to happen. What is scenario B? Scenario B is derailment or postponement of high-level dialogues between the two countries. I see that I assess that this has a probability of 50% chance of this happening over the next month to 3 months. So China will, in this scenario, suspend or indefinitely postpone scheduled high-level diplomatic or military dialogues, and as a punitive measure against India. And they will say that India's actions have been provocative, and India has created an unfavorable political atmosphere. This will halt progress on border disengagement. Okay, this could increase the risk of a prolonged military standoff or standoffs. All right, and there have been historical precedents to this. When the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to a Chinese dissident, Liu Xiaobo. Then China responded by imposing a diplomatic freeze on Norway for years. And we know that Pakistan and India frequently suspend talks, have a history of frequently suspending talks after terror attacks or political incidents. So we have historical precedents for scenario B. What is scenario C? Scenario C is something that kind of is already happening. Targeted sanctions by China on Indian entities. So, not exactly happening, but let me tell you what I mean by that. So, according to the scenario, which in my assessment has a 15% probability of happening over the next 60 to 90 days, China will sanction some Indian entities, maybe think tanks, maybe other organizations, maybe individuals, and they will claim that these individuals or organizations or think tanks have allegedly they are connected to the so-called Dalai clique. That's the term the Chinese use in double quotes, Dalai clique, and they will say that this is a counter-terrorism and anti-separatism measure. And this would be a significant escalation. It would move the conflict from mere words to concrete punitive action by China. And do we have historical precedents of this? Well, the Chinese sanctioned European Parliament members and academics in 2021 in retaliation for EU sanctions over Xinjiang. And we've had US sanctions on Chinese officials over Hong Kong and Xinjiang policies. And also, let me mention that the Chinese are currently in the process of sanctioning India. They've imposed economic sanctions on India. They have restricted the export of rare earth magnets and minerals to India. And they have also suspended. They have also stopped the supply of various kinds of fertilizers to India. So there is clear precedent for this sort of thing to happen. So that is the first forecast. What's the second forecast? Secondly, there's going to be heightened military posturing over the LAC. Whether the news media has reported this or not, I promise you this: at this time, there is going to be a high alert across the LAC, across the entire LAC. Whether the news media has reported or not doesn't matter. It's happening right now. As a consequence of the announcement made by His Holiness. So, what is this forecast? China will leverage the succession issue as a pretext to increase military pressure on India along the LAC, Arunachal Pradesh, etc. And there's going to be increased patrols. They're going to ramp up their infrastructure build-up. There could be localized standoffs and so on. So let's look at the scenarios. What's the most likely scenario? 75% probability of happening, in my assessment, over the next 2 to 3 months, or the next month, 2 months actually. So the Chinese army, the so-called PLA, People's Liberation Army, will increase the frequency of its patrols, the aggressiveness of its patrols in undemarcated areas, which is all the areas essentially, right? Because the LAC is entirely disputed. And there could be minor scuffles or fist fights or such engagements, non-lethal, hopefully. That could happen. There could be an uptick in Chinese Air Force flights near the LAC. And the objective will be to test India's response times and to signal displeasure to India. And this will have the effect of elevating the risk of an accidental escalation at the tactical level along the border, not strategic level, but tactical level. So you could, in this scenario, you could have a repeat of perhaps the Galwan-like incident potentially. And obviously, we have historical precedents to this. There was increased PLA activity following the Galwan clash 2020. Tawang sector clash in 2021 in Arunachal Pradesh, which followed a period of political tension. So I believe this has, in my assessment, this scenario has a 75% probability of happening over the next couple of months. So the LAC will now be on high alert, even if the media hasn't reported it. What is scenario B? Scenario B is a new localized standoff. I see that this has a probability of 40% of happening over the next 2 to 3 months. So China, in this scenario, initiates a new prolonged military standoff in a previously stable sector of the LAC. What do they do? They move troops in the region. They start building infrastructure across the perceived, across the LAC, and they seek to create a new pressure point and a new bargaining chip. So this could force India to divert significant military resources, and this will create a new bilateral crisis point, one that could last a long time, a protracted bilateral crisis point. Examples in history are Doklam 2017 and the Depsang Plains incursion by China in 2013, before the Modi era. So this is scenario B. In my assessment, probability of 40% of happening over the next 2 to 3 months. Scenario C has a 30% probability of happening in my assessment. This is cyber attacks on critical Indian infrastructure. This could happen anytime in the next 180 days, next 6 months. So state-backed Chinese hacking groups in this scenario could launch targeted cyber attacks against India's critical infrastructure, power grids, port logistics, financial systems, and so on. I'll not mention others, but yeah, that sort of thing. And this obviously is deniable. This is an asymmetric response, but it will send a message to India. Uh, and the impact of this is that this opens a new front against India, uh, a non-kinetic front in the conflict, and this has the potential for widespread disruption, and this has the potential for a significant Indian response as well along the same lines, cyber attacks and so on. And do we have historical precedents of this? There is a suspected Chinese cyber attack on Mumbai's power grid in 2020 during the Ladakh standoff. Reported Chinese malware intrusions into Indian port logistics systems, reported Chinese hacks into ISRO during the Chandrayaan landing, the first one, attempted landing, and so on. There's been a lot of this, right? So that is the second forecast. What's the third forecast? India will proactively leverage the Tibet card now. Now that this announcement is made, it means the gloves are off. So India has traditionally had a very cautious stance when it comes to China. But now India will slowly, subtly, and deliberately increase the political visibility of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile. And this will signal to Beijing that India holds counter leverage and India will not be passively pressurized by China. So, what are the scenarios within this forecast? Scenario A has a 70% probability of happening in my assessment. This is a high profile public engagement with Tibetan leadership over the next month to 2 months, possibly. In this scenario, senior Indian government officials, maybe cabinet ministers, possibly, could publicly meet with the Dalai Lama or congratulate the Dalai Lama on a significant occasion. And the government of India may also increase funding or logistical support for Tibetan cultural and religious institutions in India. And all of this will be highly publicized. I assess that this has a probability, a 70% chance of happening over the next 30 to 60 days. And this will signal a hardening of India's position on Tibet. India will now move Tibet from a purely humanitarian issue to a geopolitical tool, and this will once again have the effect of raising the status of Tibet to a disputed territory. And we have historical precedents of this. Prime Minister Modi's birthday greetings to the Dalai Lama in 2022, which was a break from the past. In the past, we had private wishes. Now it was public. And India allowing the Tibetan government in exile to host a large Thank You India event in 2018, despite Chinese objections and so on. So that is scenario A, 70% likelihood of happening over the next 30 to 60 days. What is scenario B? Scenario B has, in my assessment, a 35% chance of happening over the next year, next 365 days. In this scenario, India's government will approve and facilitate a visit by the Dalai Lama to a strategically so-called sensitive area, what the Chinese call a sensitive area, which is a border area such as Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh or the Ladakh region. And India will say that this is a purely religious visit, a religious pilgrimage. The impact of this is that this will represent a direct challenge to China's territorial claims and China's narrative over Tibetan Buddhism. And you have historical precedents of this. In 2017, His Holiness the Dalai Lama visited Tawang, which was met with a very harsh response and very angry response from China. This is scenario B. In my assessment, 35% chance of this happening over the next year. What is scenario C? In scenario C, which in my opinion has a 10% chance of happening over the next year. India's MEA, Ministry of External Affairs, will formally invite the Sikyong, the president of the Tibetan government in exile, for official talks. Or maybe an Indian government official will publicly attend a Tibetan government in exile formal function, which has the effect of granting the Tibetan government in exile quasi official recognition. This, I think, has a 10% chance of happening over the next 365 days. This will be a fundamental shift in India's Tibet policy. This could cross the reddest of Chinese red lines, and it could risk a diplomatic rupture. So these are all tools in the toolkit that you can deploy as and when required. You've had historical precedents of this. The US invited the Sikyong to the White House and the State Department in 2020-21, and India could do something similar going forward, maybe in the next 365 days. So we have historical precedents of this. What is scenario? What's the fourth forecast? The fourth forecast is that there's going to be an escalation in the intelligence domain and the covert action domain. This succession announcement by the Dalai Lama will trigger a covert great game between Indian intelligence agencies and Chinese intelligence agencies on Indian soil, possibly in neighboring countries, possibly, maybe, who knows, even in Tibet, Chinese occupied Tibet. And the focus will be on monitoring, influencing, and controlling the key figures and communities involved in the reincarnation process. So China will be the hostile actor to a large extent in this. Let's see the scenarios. What is the most likely scenario? This scenario has a 90% probability of happening in my assessment over the next 7 to 90 days. Immediate, essentially. So in this scenario, China's MSS, Ministry of State Security, which is China's equivalent of the RAW. So the Chinese MSS will intensify its efforts to infiltrate Tibetan communities in India and in Nepal, to gather intelligence about what's happening, to identify potential successor candidates to the Dalai Lama, and to possibly cultivate pro-Beijing lamas. And India's IB and RAW will ramp up counter-intelligence operations to protect the Tibetan government in exile and to neutralize Chinese agents. This, in my assessment, has a very high probability of happening. 90% chance of happening in the next 7 to 90 days. So which means that it's already on. This game will probably already be on. So this will increase mistrust between the two nations at the intelligence level. It will raise the risk of espionage-related diplomatic incidents. And you've had numerous cases in the past of individuals arrested in India for spying for China. And often these individuals were targeting Tibetan communities or military installations. And you had the defection of the 17th Karmapa from Tibet to India in 1999, which was a major disaster for China. So you have precedents of this. What's scenario B? Scenario B, in my assessment, has a 45% chance of happening over the next year. This is a Chinese attempt to influence or co-opt a key religious figure. China will attempt a significant covert operation to either exfiltrate a key high-ranking Lama involved in the search process from India or Nepal into China, or to bribe somebody or coerce someone, one of these Lamas, into supporting Beijing's chosen puppet candidate. This could happen over the next 1 year, maybe longer. If successful, this would be a major propaganda victory for China. And if it fails and it's exposed, it would be a major disaster, catastrophic diplomatic incident for China. And we have historical precedents for this. The abduction and replacement of the Dalai Lama's chosen Panchen Lama in 1995. And there have been allegations of Chinese pressure on the selection of other reincarnated lamas, the tulkus. That's an ongoing situation. So this scenario B has a 45% probability of happening over the next year or maybe longer. What is scenario C? Scenario C is that India will actively secure a reincarnation candidate on Indian soil. So this will happen within a year of the Dalai Lama's eventual passing, whenever it happens. We do not wish him to pass away. I hope that he lives as long as is humanly possible. But eventually, he will have to leave his body, as do all human beings who live on planet Earth. So, post the passing of the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, within these 365 days, scenario C could become a reality. So, India's security and intelligence establishment will work closely with the Tibetan government in exile to ensure that the formal search process identifies a candidate born within India's borders, and then India will proactively secure the child and his family to prevent any Chinese interference. This will happen within 365 days of the eventual passing of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This has, in my opinion, in my assessment, a 25% chance of happening. And this will present China with a fait accompli, a done deal. And this will create a direct succession lineage outside of Chinese controlled, Chinese occupied territory. And this will institutionalize the dispute for decades, maybe generations, if the Chinese hold on Tibet lasts for decades or generations. So the key assumption to this is that behind this scenario, the key assumptions are, first of all, that the Dalai Lama's instructions are clear that his reincarnation should be found in India. I'm not sure if he has said that, but in case his instructions are of that kind, then scenario C should come to pass. And secondly, the assumption is that India makes a strategic calculation that hosting the 15th Dalai Lama is a long-term strategic asset against China. Do we have historical precedents? So the discovery of the current Dalai Lama when he was a child in Tibet was a process independent of the Chinese government, the so-called Chinese government. Right? There was no Chinese government hand in the discovery of the 14th Dalai Lama, the present Dalai Lama. And India will seek to replicate this legitimacy. So that is the fourth forecast. We have one more to go. There's going to be the weaponization of economic interdependence. Both nations are economically interdependent to a certain extent. So both nations will increasingly use non-tariff barriers, investment screening, other economic tools as instruments of political coercion related to the issue of Tibet. So we're going to move beyond the current trend of de-risking. We're going to have more targeted punitive economic statecraft. What is scenario A, the most likely scenario? This, in my assessment, has a probability of 75% of happening. 75% probability of happening over the next 30 to 90 days. India will intensify its scrutiny of Chinese investments. India will intensify its scrutiny of Chinese visa applications for Chinese engineers, executives, etc. And India will intensify its audits of Chinese firms operating in India. And China will reciprocate. China will respond with customs delays. China will respond with arbitrary inspections, unofficial buy local campaigns against Indian products and services. And this will create significant friction for businesses on both sides. This will further chill the bilateral economic relationship. I mean, we have had historical precedents. India banned hundreds of Chinese mobile apps starting in 2020. China, when it comes to South Korea, China unofficially boycotted South Korean goods after the THAAD THAAD missile defense system was deployed in South Korea. It's an American missile defense system, right? And China imposed restrictions on Australian imports like wine and coal, etc., during a period of political tension not very long ago. So we have historical precedents. What is scenario B? Scenario B is a harder scenario. Formal investment bans in sensitive sectors. So this will be initiated by India. I think I assess this as a 35% probability of happening over the next 6 months. Maybe sooner. So India will cite national security. And citing national security, India will formally ban new Chinese investment in specific strategic sectors like telecommunications, renewable energy, fintech, financial technology, and so on. And China will retaliate by placing maybe a major Indian IT company or a major pharmaceutical company on its unreliable entity list. So this will accelerate the strategic decoupling and technological decoupling between the two nations. And we have historical precedents like the US CHIPS Act, other legislation designed to restrict Chinese access to semiconductor technology, and India's de facto ban on Chinese telecommunications gear from its 5G networks. That is scenario B, 35% probability of happening over the next 6 months. What is scenario C? Scenario C is disruption of critical supply chains. In my assessment, 10% chance of this happening over the next year. In this scenario, China deliberately restricts the export of a critical raw material or industrial component on which India is heavily dependent, maybe specific active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, rare earth minerals. Some of it is already happening, as we know, and this could cause a major disruption in a key Indian industry. China is already testing such measures. Uh, the impact of this is that this could be a major economic shock for India, and this could potentially force a capitulation to China or a major global effort, massive global effort to diversify supply chains. Why do I say this is a 10% chance of happening? This is something the Chinese will very much want to happen, want to do. So why does it have a 10% chance of happening? It's because, in my opinion, India will already have taken this into account and put measures in place to ensure that there isn't a major economic shock for India. And we have historical precedents of this. China's 2010 restriction of rare earth exports to Japan during a territorial dispute. I think it was the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands dispute, and China's ongoing restrictions of rare earths and specialty fertilizer exports to India, which is kind of like economic sanctions. So that's the deal. The Dalai Lama succession announcement has been made. It will significantly intensify, and it will significantly broaden the Tibet dispute, the Tibet border dispute. Tibet is a disputed territory. Tibet is not Chinese territory, and this will significantly intensify and broaden the India-China conflict over the next year, maybe over the next several years, and tensions between the two countries will most likely escalate. I can assure you, once again, let me say this, that the Indian media may not have reported this, but the LAC is now on high alert. Indian security forces, the Indian military is on high alert across the LAC, and tensions may escalate beyond the border, the LAC. This could become a multi-front gray zone confrontation between the two nations. You could have coercive diplomacy that is employed. There could be intelligence operations. There could be targeted economic pressure from both sides, and most likely both nations will seek to avoid a direct armed conflict. But there's going to be increased friction across multiple domains, and that raises the risks, the probability of a miscalculation, which means that the next year, the next coming weeks and months, and probably the next year are going to be it's going to be a period of heightened tension, heightened volatility between the two nations. And India, for the first time in my memory, is gonna it seems to be adopting a more assertive posture on Tibet. And it looks like India has decided that there's no chance of a rapprochement with China. So a decision has been made at some point, at some level, probably at the highest level. And yeah, we're going to have a more assertive approach towards the Tibet dispute and towards India-China relations. So that brings me to the end of today's episode. Thank you for watching. I hope that you found some value in this. Please like, please subscribe if you already haven't.